The High Elves. Great infantry and missiles, supported by cavalry and monsters, the High Elf armies field a variety of units into a great playstyle, amplified by their magic. In this video I'll show you every single unit before and after research XP Redline skills. I'll also go over the lords and heroes and their abilities in campaign. So, just to give an example of how this works, basically I'll give you the unit card basically as it is in the game, and then the upgrades with the Redline skills, the research buffs and the XP, so that you can see the stats after those upgrades. And this of course will help you determine better your compositions, in campaign, so that you can have a better grasp of how the unit will look like and how effective it will be against specific enemies. And yeah, that's the sole purpose of this army roster. So their play style and army has the advantages of having great infantry, great missile infantry, good cavalry and chariots. They do lack some armor piercing, great single entities. They do have the disadvantages of having only average artillery, and they lack some early armor piercing. It's a very balanced out faction with great magic to assist. So the first special ability basically of the army is martial prowess. This affects nearly every single unit from the High Elf roster, really. Gives them melee defense and a little bit of melee attack when the hit points are greater than 25%. So basically your units are always more effective up until the later stages of the battle. And we have the upgraded version, the Martial Mastery. This is an improved version of the Martial Prowess for specific units, more the elite troops, with the same implication that it applies until they reach minus 25% health. The major advantage is of course that increase in melee attack. Instead of +2, it's +8. Tyrion, heavily armored, tons of damage and survivability. That is Tyrion. An absolute beast in single combat with great armor values, great melee attack and melee defense. Do note these are enhanced here by the Martial Mastery. And he also has a lot of weapon strength, which is also mainly armor piercing. So he has a nice fire resistance too, so it's one of the best duelists in the game. Really, you never need to worry when sending him against another lord, another single entity. Just be wary of his relatively lower hit point count, but still he has a tool against that, as you're going to see in just a few moments. For his abilities in the campaign, he has Hold the Line, giving melee defense and leadership to all allies near him. Do note this is only if you pick Majesty of Ulthuan instead of Bloodline of Anarian, mind that. Then we have Feint and Riposte. This is quite a significant buff. It gives him 24 melee defense, 24 melee attack, and 20% physical resistance. This is great when fighting other lords or single entities, especially if they don't have any magical attacks to deny that physical resistance, so be wary of that. Then we have the Sunfang ability, a breath attack doing a nice deal of damage, although without armor piercing, mostly major magical and fire damage. And then we have the Heart of Avalon, giving a tremendous amount of health really fast when Tyrion is below 25%. This alone gives him a much needed health pool, and it has a 120-second cooldown, so it can proc several times. If he survives, and he gets once more to the 25%, this still happens. So it's really a great saving grace for Tyrion on those duels with other lords. Next, we have Teclis, a great spellcaster. Teclis has a interesting mixed lore with plenty of different ones. You can see that he has, from the lore of fire, the Flaming Sword of Ruin. He has from the lore of heavens, the Chain Lightning. So he also has regrowth from the lore of life. So it's all very interesting, one from each lore, really. He's very weak in single combat, low at melee attack and defense values, very low armor, low weapon strength. Really should not be in combat unless you give him a mount. So in campaign, he does have the bounce spell Fireball. Nothing to talk about this, everyone knows, one of the most basic spells and definitely good to have it, good versus single entities, good range, good damage, etc. Then he also has the Glamour of Hoeth, this passive ability that affects allies in 55 meters, which is quite a good range, giving them more leadership and charge resistance, plus 200%, which is always nice. Then we have the Potion of Sharoi. This one has 4 uses, gives them a tremendous amount of heal per second, which is always nice. And it does increase cooldowns, and it gives them a ward save, 40% ward save. So it's really cool to keep him out of any trouble, really. Then he also gets the Scroll of Hoeth. This one is nice against enemy casters, so he targets one and gives them minus 40% power recharge and plus 30 seconds to cooldowns, which is always nice. Then you also have the Sword of Teclis. This gives him good power reserves per second and spell mastery as well. So you pop up the sword and then you use one of your spells, and of course it will do a lot more damage or have different effects. It's always cool. Coming up next, we have Alariel the Radiant, another great spellcaster. Alariel, she does not have a lot in terms of combat stats. Be careful putting her in combat. She has slightly higher melee defense and higher melee attack as well, a bit more weapon strength, but certainly a lord that can only go versus other caster heroes or low quality infantry in combat. So keep her away. Her main notion is actually the varied magic with the mixed lore of life, of light, and high magic. Very interesting lore as well, so that's the main usage that you'll use her in combat for. Just be sure that, you know, give her a mount to ensure that she doesn't get into combat that soon, because of course she's very weak in combat. So in campaign, she has the Staff of Avalorn, giving someone a power recharge rate increase and completely giving him minus 100% miscast chance, so there's no miscast there. It can affect, of course, one ally or herself. And then we can use the Boon of Isha. This is passive, giving everyone a magical attacks and immunity to psychology. We also have the Shield Stone of Isha, giving a ward save, also passive ability, giving physical resistance to allies in range. So she always needs to be a little bit closer to the front line, for instance, or following someone to give this passive ability. And then we also have the Star of Avalorn, basically just the two uses of a regeneration area buff, which is really cool. It can affect 3 allies, of course, so by all means it's a nice effect range, so you can heal up your friendly units and make them fight for a longer time. And now we have Alithanar, a good hybrid lord with decent melee stats and great missile stats as well. So low armor, but good melee attack and good melee defense values. Decent weapon strength, but it's not mainly armor piercing. He has a tremendous range and ammunition as well. And the missile strength is majority armor piercing. So he's great at picking specific targets apart, such as enemy lords and single entities from quite afar. He also has vanguard deployment and fires whilst moving, further enhancing his ability of being this great hybrid lord. He'll just wreck the enemy before even having to go in close combat, which is the main idea of the lord. So for his abilities in campaign, he has Mislead, giving unspottable stalk and stipe to a unit, creates an image of Alithanar, but it does not cause damage. Now this upgrades in the Shadow King here, if you choose it, which gives him the Call of the Shadow Dancer, same effects, but the image does cause 50% damage. Really cool. Then we also have the Stone of Midnight, an area passive ability giving plus 30% missile resistance. Finally, he's kind of like those assassin heroes. He has the slippery speed and melee defense to him, and augment a nice one to ensure that he can get wherever you wish him to. And then he also has a magic missile here, the Volley of High Arrows, great armor piercing damage, good penetration. It's quite effective against single targets, really. Now, in terms of the quest items that he can get, will get the ability from them, the Shadow Crown. This increases allies' speed and melee defense in an area. And then the ability, the Moon Bow, another armor piercing missile damage, very strong versus a single unit, really a lot of powerful explosions. So yeah, it does require all these magic missiles. Note that you do require line of sight to the target. Eltharion the Grim, a great mix of spellcaster lord and melee lord, so it has the lore of high magic here, very useful. He has great armor but no shield, good melee attack, tremendous melee attack, and good melee defense, and a nice weapon strength. The biggest issue is that it doesn't have a lot of armor piercing, really. So overall, a very good spellcaster and mix with melee lord to bring out. It's really cool to use him in campaign. So for his abilities, he does have Grin Discipline. It increases his melee defense and melee attack. He can then give this to the whole army. As you can see there, passive abilities for Lord's Army, replacing Martial Mastery and Martial Prowess, by the way. So he gives a nice melee defense and melee attack to everyone without the issues with the Martial Mastery or the Martial Prowess either. Now, he also has the Mistwalker's Barrage, basically a bombardment spell, good armor piercing there, good explosive armor piercing damage as well. It only recharges if he's engaged in melee, which is really strong still, so very nice bombardment spell for Eltharion here. Then he has the Unending Ammunition. Let me locate it. It is here. There we go. Unending Volley. That's what it calls. Basically, it gives ammunition to allies. 25-second cooldown, so it's unending. You can give them ammunition throughout the match. And in terms of his abilities that he gets from the items, from the quest items. So the Helm of Ivresse, which is giving an ally unbreakable, and the entities cannot die while ability is active. So this is excellent, if not just for the unbreakable, but actually for the entities cannot die. If they're about to be hit by a massive spell, just pop this one up. At least they'll lose health, of course, but at least the entities cannot die. Maybe you can heal them later on, that sort of idea. And of course the unbreakable is also useful, but still. Then we have the Fang Sword of Eltharion, giving him magical attacks, armor piercing damage, and a physical resistance of 40%. Really useful. Imric, he is a good anti-large melee lord. He's decent even without a mount, but he's of course much more effective on his dragons. Still, great armor, great melee attack and melee defense values, great weapon strength, which is also armor piercing and has a nice bonus versus large. So he's great at facing off enemy lords and heroes on mounts or enemy single entities, anything really. And he also has a nice fire resistance. A very nice lord, especially when in mount he gets to be one of the most important duelists in the game. So, for Imric's abilities in campaign, he has the Star Lance, giving flaming attacks and flammable to enemies, a good nice charge bonus, armor piercing weapon damage, and charge speed right there. He also has the ability Ashen Fields, which gives a weakness to every single enemy in range, which is, you know, all the battle map. So every single enemy will get a weakness to fire damage, which is really great. Then he also has the Dragon Pact, which gives him the bounce spell Piercing Bolts of Burning. This is a bombardment spell with 4 charges, major armor, piercing magical, and fire damage. In addition, something really changed here is the Dragon Horn ability, which you can give melee attack plus 24 and can cause fear to allies in range. Typically this is just a leadership buff, but in this case for Imric he already has a nice ability there. In addition, he also gets the passive ability Lord of Dragons. This is a hex that gives an enemy melee defense and melee attack reduction, severely melee defense and melee attack reduction. And in terms of his quests, the Armor of Calador ability will give him a nice heal per second there, but it does decrease cooldowns, gives him vigor per second, but he cannot move, so it has that downside. The Prince is a nice lord, actually. He has good armor and a nice shield there, a silver shield, so not a lot of missile fire that can hit him. He also has good melee attack and melee defense values, like most High Elves. Really, they are really good at it. He also has decent weapon strength, not a lot of armor piercing, but still a very good frontline lord to use and to support your troops. And finally, we do have the Princess. She's a hybrid weapon lord, really. So decent stats in combat, not a lot of armor, of course, but decent weapon strength, not a lot of armor piercing here. But the main idea is that she also has a ranged attack. Lots of ammunition, so you're never going to run out during a battle, really. Decent range and good missile strength. Not too much armor piercing, but still significant, I would say. So yeah, that's the main role. You know, she'll be good at picking enemies apart from afar, and then of course if she needs to hold her own in battle in melee, she can also do so, especially after having reduced their hit points with the ranged attacks. If casting is your thing, you can bring an Archmage with several tons of lores for you to choose from. She's weak in combat unless you give it a lowered mount, of course. Weak armor, weak melee attack, keep away and cast spells the most as like with most caster lords, that's what I mean. And the weapon strength is not really a lot of armor piercing, really negligible, so keep her away from any combat. Just make sure that she's close by to cast those important spells. So your Archmages will always have at rank 10 the bounce spell Chain Lightning, a very good Vortex spell, good against nearly anything really that has armor, strong versus multiple units. You know how Vortex works, so it's really a cool addition that you have 2 uses of such a nice spell overall. So the Handmaiden, a good hybrid hero, melee and ranged, with a focus on range of course. So decent stats, low armor, but very good melee attack and melee defense, especially good weapon strength, which also has a bonus versus large. So she's good at taking out any enemy cavalry that shows up, or anything large really that shows up. She'll take care of them. The main purpose of course is the range. A good range with flaming ammunition and magical attacks, and also armor piercing missiles to take care of anyone really from afar. A good hero, great hero actually, to have in any circumstance, to either take care of those single entities for instance, or support your missile troops. So in terms of abilities in campaign, the Handmaidens can get the Guardian ability, which affects, heroes or lords in range, giving them physical resistance, always nice. She can also get the Entangle ability. This has 2 charges. The enemies in range cannot move. It's an area hex, by the way, they cannot move, and they have weakness to fire damage, which is great. It combines really well with anything that has fire damage, of course. Do note that you have to choose among these, so the one that I'm showing you have to choose, you cannot use with the Entangle. And this one, Hawkish Precision, this ability gives missile units in range plus 15% to their armor piercing missile damage only, but of course only enabled if there's no enemy presence in the ability range, so you gotta be careful with that. And the range is 70 meters, so it's only really useful when, in the early stages of the fight. Now for the Noble, he's a great melee hero, focuses on until large. He has good armor, but lacking a shield, better defense than attack values, a good weapon strength, which is also mainly armor piercing, and has a nice bonus as large. He's great to actually defend, to support your lord from enemy lords or heroes that try to come up against him or her. Coming up next, the Law Masters of Holeth. Basically, these guys are really good hybrid spellcasters and melee heroes. Good armor with a shield, great melee attack and melee defense values. Weapon strength is armor piercing and has a bonus versus infantry. So he's good in combat against those heroes, against those single entities, or against infantry, of course. He has a nice focus in terms of his spells on buffing units, or has slightly some debuffs with this direct damage spell with the reduced speed there. So mostly is about doing some damage, or doing focusing on buffing your units or helping them out with the regeneration, which is always excellent. Very flexible hero to bring in any army composition. Now we have your caster hero, the Mage. Basically, like all spellcasters, not a lot of combat stats, so keep them away unless you give them a mount. For the majority, like all casters, it's about their Lord of Magic. And the High Elves are kings, really. They have plenty. They have beasts, death, fire, heavens, high, life, light, metal, shadows. Everything you may wish for. In essence, just the amount of variety that you can get just because of these heroes is tremendous. So just make sure that you get a composition that will thrive under that specific lore of magic, and that's about it. You'll get a plenty of variety just with the magic, let alone all the units that you have. First, we have the Spearmen, a typical Spearman unit, but they do have a decent shield, so it's quite significant that they have a silver shield. They're very well protected against enemy missiles, decent, or rather weak actually, melee attack, but very decent melee defense. Their weapon strength, of course, they do have that bonuses versus large. Do note, they don't naturally have this ward save, I'll explain it in just a moment, but of course you always have to count when I'm showcasing the High Elf roster that they they always have that martial prowess because their hit points are always greater than 25%. So they have lesser melee defense and melee attack and leadership than what is shown here, but of course that's the influence of that martial prowess. So still a nice charge reflection and charge defense versus large. Typically you're going to use these guys to defend against the enemy cavalry or anything really. They're good against, you know, the tier 1 infantries. In the late game, of course, their stats become much better. All improved stats all over the board, including a special note that they actually get more weapon strength and they get decent melee defense, so they can advance to a tier 2 unit very easily. Always a good choice to cover your flanks from enemy cavalry, especially mid-tier, up to mid-tier cavalry. And now to a Regiment of Renown, the Scions of Mathlan. Spearman Regiment of Renown, still the same, shielded, good stats, weapon strength with the bonuses versus large, but they now have actually an aura of protection. They give a ward save of 10% to allies in 35 meters. So these guys are always useful in any circumstance. You can use these guys even in the late game because of course that aura alone is quite effective, giving some good buffs to your front line. And next we have the Rangers. These are a dual sword infantry. Basically these are your earliest anti-infantry unit that you can have. They have decent stats, not a lot of armor, so be careful. They're very vulnerable to enemy missiles. Their main advantage is that they do have that bonuses versus infantry. So they're great at taking out tier 2, tier 1 infantry from the enemy. They have some physical resistance, which is always nice. But yeah, in the late game, of course, you can still field a couple of these guys. Of course, you'll have better options, but don't underestimate the fact that these guys can get, you know, decent melee stats up to tier 2 really, and especially they get decent speed, 46. It's really nice. So even having a couple of these guys, while they don't die off so that they can replace, is still nice well into the late game. Now, the first of the true, let's say, elite units that you have, the White Lions of Trace. So they're typically like a middle-class unit, but you can definitely use these guys later on if you choose. So, good melee attack and melee defense. First, they are armor piercing, which is the best idea about them. They don't have a shield, they do have lots of armor, so it's really excellent. Still, they have a hefty 30% missile resistance. So it's really great to use these guys in every circumstance. There's especially some lords that have buffs to White Lions, and then you can use them well into the late game. A good armor piercing unit, and as you can see, the stats only increase really well, especially melee attack and melee defense. They get crazy good value and the weapon strength, so you can still use these guys well into the late game, especially against weaker front lines from other races. And now to another Regiment of Renown, the Pure Main Company, White Lions of Trace ROR. Basically, the same version. They do have that armor piercing, they do have good stats, but they also have the Guardian ability, which is excellent to have these guys in support of a lord or hero, giving him that physical resistance, which is always nice. And they do get the Sundered Armor, so they're really good to use in any combination just because of that Sundered Armor. Get them against anything that has armor, and they'll become much weaker for your missiles or for other troops. Now we have the Silvern Guard, really well armored and with a silver shield, which is always nice, so not a lot of missile fire going through them. They don't have too much melee attack, but they excel in melee defense, and their weapon strength, once more, they do have that bonuses versus large. It has an improved weapon strength from the normal Spearman, so of course you can always go in from Spearman into the Silvern Guard, especially for your flanks. Very useful against anything that is large, really. They also have a natural spell resistance of 30%. Now in the late game, of course, they become much better at their jobs. Really, they're good holding infantry throughout, more armor, more melee attack and melee defense values, and especially they do still get some more weapon strength, so they'll always be very good against those large targets or just holding the line for your missiles to do the damage. Now to one of the top tier infantry units in the game, the Swordmasters of Hoeth. Basically tons of armor with a silver shield. Actually, you notice they don't have a shield. They only block 20% of the missiles instead of the 35 typical. That is typical. This is why? Because they use the swords to deflect enemy missiles. Yeah, you heard it right. Then we have good melee attack, good melee defense, especially for an infantry unit that is basically a damage dealer. Good weapon strength, armor piercing with a nice bonus versus infantry, and they still have that martial mastery, so you know they're augmented well into their 25% health. In the late game, of course, you're going to field a lot of these guys if you wish. They are just one of the top tier infantry units. They get great melee attack and melee defense values, even more weapon strength. So yeah, never question whatsoever the usefulness of these guys well into the late game. And if you would like a more elite infantry unit, but to deal with large units, nothing better than the Phoenix Guard. So they're heavily armored, they don't have a shield, that's kind of their weakness. They do have good melee attack and melee defense stats, very good melee defense actually. Their weapon strength is armor piercing and it does have that bonuses versus large, so they excel at defeating anything that's large. Lords or mounts, single entities, a beast of a Carnosaur, whatever comes their way, they'll defeat it. They're good complement with the sword masters. There you have the sole infantry line that you need. In addition, they do cause fear, which is excellent, and they have that 30% physical resistance, which is always nice. In the late game, that physical resistance even increases. They get still more ward save, more weapon strength, more melee defense, more melee attack. These guys just wreck anything, even other infantry, by the way. It's just their typical role, of course, is to defeat large entities, but never be afraid of putting them against other infantry units, because they will do quite a good job as well. And now to the Keepers of the Flame, a regiment of renown as well. These guys are crazy good. Phoenix Guard with anti-large, with that armor piercing, with better stats, and they also have magical attacks. So not only are they good against anti-large, but also against those ethereal units, those demon units. Definitely you should put them against them. They're still causing fear. They still have a 30% physical resistance, so yeah. It should be noted, I didn't mention in the previous one, but they do have expert charge defense. That also applies to the other Phoenix Guard, so they negate the charge bonus of any attacker. They don't have a lot of charge bonus themselves, so just keep them holding and they'll do the damage. The first ranged units, the archers. Now, these appear to be very basic units, really. Not a lot in terms of melee or attack or defense, or even weapon strength, really. They shouldn't be in melee in any circumstances. But their range is quite good. 180 is really good for any missile infantry troop, which is excellent. It just allows them to do their damage much before the enemy comes forth. And in addition to that, it does still have decent armor piercing, especially for an archer unit. It's such a basic unit. They're really good up until the mid game, maybe even into the late game in some compositions, especially because they do get more ammunition, more missile strength, and even better reload time. So they're really good at doing precisely their job well into the late game, peppering the enemy down with missiles, you know, getting them weaker until they reach your front line, and then it's all over for them. And if you wish a better unit in terms of archers, especially for the early game, the archers with light armor. At least they will have a little bit more armor, more resistance to those missiles or those melee attacks that come forth. You know, in case they are under attack, they can still survive a little bit better. So that's always nice. Overall, it's the same unit, but just with more armor. So in essence, if you can purchase these guys, by all means go for them. They're well worth the cost. Similarly to into the late game in terms of upgrades, the same thing. They get more missile strength, more ammunition, more reload time, or less reload time actually, so that's always great. They do get better improved stats altogether. They reach up to 60 armor, so they're kinda decent in melee later on, but they shouldn't really be put into melee unless you know what you're doing, of course. Now to Regiment of Renown, the Talons of Tor Kaleda. Archers with light armor, Regiments of Renown. So they still are the same as the other archers, still good melee attack and melee defense values in armor, so they can withstand a little bit of punishment. But the main idea here is that not only they have a 30% fire resistance, which is always helpful, but they also have flaming ammunition and they cause flammable. So whoever they hit will get the weakness to fire damage, which is always nice. Do note that they do have the martial mastery instead of the martial prowess, which is always cool. So these guys are really helpful to have in any army, just for that fact that they put that flammable. So I really love when they get, you know, small details like this that just make an ROR unit useful throughout the game, such as with these guys, the Talons of Tor Kaleda. Now to one of the best units in any roster really, the Lothern Sea Guard. Why? Because they're missile and spear infantry. They have a bonuses versus large in their weapon strength, and they do have that charge defense against large, which means that cavalry, especially low, mid-tier cavalry that tries to flank these guys is going to have a nasty surprise, because they can withstand some punishment from large units and large entities, which is great. This is a missile infantry, an archer unit, a very good archer unit. Not a lot of range compared to, well, still decent amount of range, but not as much as the regular archers. Still the same missile strength with good armor-piercing missile damage there, but the main idea about these guys is, of course, they can survive if cavalry reaches them, which is excellent. Especially into the late game, their stats improve really well, so they can be even a holding infantry to your forces while you have better ones in reserve, and that's the sort of idea that I want you to have for these Lothian Sea Guards. Especially into the late game, they're always useful. Now to a regiment of renown, the Storm Riders. The biggest idea different between these guys and the other Lothian Sea Guards, not only just in terms of stats, but they also have the Vanguard deployment. They fire whilst moving, which is great for a unit of this caliber, and they also cause fear. So that alone is already good enough. This unit can be in any roster, even well into the late game. Just be sure that you benefit from that ability of them firing while moving, which is always excellent. They have the Vanguard, so they can pepper. Imagine they can pepper enemy low quality cav or low quality infantry. They keep moving, they are reasonably fast, and if the enemy tries to take them out, they can just hold and brace and hit them with their lances in combat. So it's really a great versatile infantry unit for any roster. Lothian Sea Guard with shields. As if it wasn't enough, you can get these guys with the silver shield nonetheless. So they are effective against low quality cavalry, against medium cavalry, and against infantry, and then against other missile units. So they are effectively, because of their range and that silver shield, they can withstand punishment from other missiles and give it back. That's really a great addition to any roster, and in the High Elves, of course, it just fits in so nicely. Even to the late game, they can have a presence in any army, really. Those melee attack and melee defense stats are really good. The weapon strength is still relevant, good armor, good speed, and then they still get the improved missile stats, which is always nice. So these guys, always a nice idea to have a couple of units of these guys in any army, especially in the flanks, but you can field armies of just these guys and other units well into the late game. Shadow Warriors. Basically, they do have that decent range of the archers once more, so these are kind of like an upgrade. Still better stats in terms of melee defense and melee attack, so these guys can withstand some punishment. They can defeat some missile units, they can defeat some weaker weaker infantry, of course. Not a lot of armor-piercing damage, but still, that's not their main purpose. What they are is really good in all the hiding aspects. They have Vanguard deployment, they fire whilst moving, and they have Stalk. Which means that these guys, they'll be a nasty surprise to anyone if the enemy is not prepared, and if you find a weakness to use these guys, you can definitely benefit from having like a couple of these units or even 4 of them in any army. You can use them as basic archers on behind your front line, or even in the Vanguard deployment, whatever. As soon as you find a usefulness for these guys, you'll be addicted to using them throughout and into the late game. They're really good. They can become even better melee fighters with more melee attack and more armor, of course, which is always helpful, and still they benefit from quite a lot of improvements in terms of missiles. So yeah, definitely a great unit for any High Elf roster. And if you want the ultimate ambushers, the Grey, simply called the Grey. What is their major difference? They still have the Vanguard, the fire whilst moving, but they also have Snipe, which means that they can remain hidden while firing. If the AI is not really checking, or if you're fighting against another player, it's very easy to miss this aspect. And of course, they can also give the Stalk ability and the speed and Unspottable to an ally in range, which is excellent. Can you imagine Swordmasters with Unspottable and Stalk? Can you imagine that? So that sort of idea, it's really great to use these guys in any army composition. Definitely a great ROR unit. Not one of the best units in the entire game, not just the army roster, the entire game, the Sisters of Avalon. So not only did they have decent melee stats, so they can withstand punishment from lower quality troops by all means. Anyone comes up to them to catch them unawares, they'll have a nasty surprise as they are able to do some damage even in combat. Weapon strength 32 is still not that bad, really. It's better than swordsmen, for instance, and they have the stats to fight them. But the best idea, of course, is their range. They have 180 with armor-piercing missile strength, which is excellent in any, and then they have magical attacks and flammable, so flaming attacks. So basically, there's nothing that really can withstand their punishment in terms of attacks. In the late game, they just become a terror to anyone, really. Improved ammunition, improved missile strength, and lesser reload time. They still get some physical resistance, some missile resistance, better stats overall. So you can field entire armies of these guys. It's quite a doom stack if you wish. But even if you don't use it as such, if you just use them on the back of your front line, they will do the damage that you need for certain. Always a good addition to any high elf army. And if it wasn't enough, you still have an ROR of the Sisters of Avalon, the Everqueen's Court Guards. In essence, better stats overall. Look at those stats, 47, 60. This is tier 3 infantry right there, if it weren't for the armor. And they still have that range, that missile strength, that ammunition, magical attacks and flaming ammunition. So what changes for them? Well, they do have a power recharge, so they can help out in an area the casters that you may have, and they still provide encourage. So a wonderful unit to have in any army. Just be sure that you have at least one caster to benefit from that effect, and that's up to it. So to the first cavalry unit, the Illyrian Reavers. A very good shock cavalry, very fast. They do have vanguard deployment, which is excellent. That alone makes them very useful well into the mid game, at least, to get around the enemy, get rid of their artillery, get rid of any units that are, weaker to them. They're really good, especially with that speed. They have decent armor, decent melee attack and melee defense, which is always improved by the martial prowess, of course, so be wary of that. Not a lot of weapon strength. Into the late game, you can still field a couple of these guys. They get more speed to the point that they are really fast. 120, it's abusive fast. Not a lot in terms of increased melee attack or melee defense, so they're always like a shock cavalry. It's still a light, medium cavalry idea, but still, you can field these guys, especially under those lords that have improvements for the Illyrian Reavers, or that have at least reduced upkeep. So yeah, a good unit to have in, let's say, a sweeper army. Definitely one of the best actually in the roster, just because of how versatile it is. If you want a replacement for them, the Silver Helms. These are kind of like the medium tier, really. They have a good amount of armor, no shield. There's a variation with the shield, but they do have good melee attack and melee defense stats, decent weapon strength, and decent charge bonus. Of course, everything here screams just use them as a shock cavalry, and a nice shock cavalry they are, especially into the late game where they get tremendous amounts of speed and extra charge bonus. They will always be good, hitting the enemy on their backs or their flanks, and yeah, that's the main usage that we always find for the Silver Helms. Of course, they may be outclassed by the next unit. So the Silver Helms with shields. These guys have exactly the same stats, but they do have that shield which blocks 30% of missile fire, so much more useful. They still have a little bit more melee defense, so well into the late game they become more of a melee cav, really. They don't have a lot of armor piercing, so be wary of fighting any armored targets. Still the same idea, charge the rear, charge the flank. The only advantage in the late game is that you, both with these guys and the other unshielded versions, you can actually keep them a little bit longer because, of course, of how improved their stats overall are. A wonderful addition to any high elf army. Now to the first chariot unit, the Ithilmar Chariots. A very fast, actually, 84 speed is nothing too shabby, very well armored, which is always nice, and this is a good weapon strength, it has a good weapon strength, not a lot of armor piercing, but a good bonus versus infantry, so they're good dishing out damage against those infantry targets, low armor, medium armor targets. They can do well. The advantage of these chariots towards others is that they still have decent melee attack and melee defense, especially into the late game. I mean, look at those stats. They get up to 52, up to 43 melee defense. So the kind of the weakness that typical chariots get, these guys don't. They will manage to withstand some punishment, at least while in melee, which is always great. It just implies that even if you're having issues with micro, you can trust these guys to at least survive longer than other chariots. Of course, they're still chariots. You still should keep them moving and embrace that charge bonus. But they're really good at ensuring that you're not dependent on that for them to cause a little bit of damage. But if you want an upgraded version, you have it. The Lion Chariots of Thrace. One upgraded idea is that their hit points. They have good hit points for a chariot unit, lower armor of course, but it is offset by the fact that they have a missile resistance of 30%, so much better at resisting those missile attacks from the enemy. Good melee attack, good melee defense values, and the main difference as well, they have a bonus to resist infantry and mainly armor piercing damage. Great against any infantry target really, keep them moving, benefit from that speed, benefit from that charge bonus. Well into the late game you can use these guys for sure. They get improved speed and charge bonuses. They still get even more missile resistance, so enemy missiles will have a hard time taking them out. And in addition, they get improved weapon strength and melee attack and melee defense and armor. What else do you want? These guys, really a solid choice for any High Elf army. Now to the ultimate cavalry unit for the High Elves, the Dragon Princes. They're still shock cavalry, they're heavily armored, they do have a bronze shield, so they can survive that a little bit. Good melee attack and melee defense stats, especially after that martial mastery, so be wary of their hit points because they'll become, slightly weaker after that. Still a tremendous amount of charge. They have a physical resistance of 20% and a fire resistance of 25%. What else? They don't have, unfortunately, a lot of armor piercing, but still that's a lot of weapon strength, especially if you can charge with these guys on the back of the enemy or to their missile units, even against other cavalry units, provided just that they don't hit anything that is anti-large. In the late game, they just become so much better because of their improved stats overall, melee attack, melee defense, even more charge and even more speed. They still get, some resistances, such as more physical resistance and more ward save, as you can see there. So yeah, these guys definitely a great addition to any army. Now to a Regiment of Renown unit, the Fireborn. Dragon Princes, Regiment of Renown. They're still quite a wonderful cavalry unit in itself respect, but they have flaming attacks and their weapon strength also has the bonuses versus large. So these guys are great to be in any of your flanks. Of course you can only bring one, but can imagine if you could bring more. Anti-large masters, really, they do have quite a lot of fire resistance and still that nice physical resistance. They do have that martial mastery, so yeah, you can use these guys well into the late game with any army composition. I was going to say, well, be wary of, I don't know, maybe other large targets, or maybe infantry, halberd infantry can wreck them, but by all means you will know by then how to use these guys. A wonderful addition to any roster. For your missile cavalry, Illyrian Reaver Archers. Very fast, they do have vanguard deployment, they can fire whilst moving. This alone makes them so versatile. You can use these units especially to harass the enemy, of course, to pick those units that really shouldn't be under the attack of enemy missiles. Note that their range is really good. Some missile infantry units don't have so much range, so they can even be skirmishes against those style of units. So overall, a very nice addition for your early, mid game, even into the late game. Of course, you may have better options, but that's because you're playing with the High Elves. Because if not, this unit would always have, in any other roster, it would always be a great unit, especially into the late game. Look at that speed. Good luck catching up to these guys. 120. Good luck. Even if you catch them, they still have decent combat stats, decent armor, decent melee attack and melee defense values, decent weapon strength, actually, as you can see there. And then they get even more range, more ammunition, more charge bonus, more missile strength. I mean, what else? You can still use these guys well into the late game if you know what you're doing, if you can pick up your targets, and if you can micro really well. I know that's a lot of ifs, but definitely a wonderful missile cavalry to have in any army. And for Regiment of Renown, the Heralds of the Wind. The main advantage here, it's not noticeable, is precisely their melee attack and melee defense values, leadership. They're really good at being a hybrid unit, so you can well use these guys against anything really, other than, you know, heavily armored targets. But especially because you can get this Regiment of Renown so early in the game, then you can definitely make use of these guys. You can then later on choose to keep them maybe in a sweeper army, and they'll always do a good job. A nice Regiment of Renown, especially for the early game, mid game, that's where you'll mostly be using these. The Cavalry Chariots. These are this is quite an interesting unit. I'll explain why. So, a typical chariot, you know, good armor, decent melee attack and melee defense, not a lot of it, but still rather decent. The weapon strength does have, you know, it's not much early armor piercing, but it has a good bonus versus infantry, so you can use them as a chariot versus lightly armored targets. But the best idea is that they have magical ammunition, quite a lot of it, and a nice missile strength, and good range. So basically these guys can pepper down any, you know, ethereal units from afar, any single entities that have a lot of that have a lot of physical resistance, of course. You can pick those targets really well, and they're really good against those, especially because, you know, good luck trying to catch them. They have decent speed, and into the game, into the late game, they become so much better. Added speed, added stats. They become like a good chariot overall, you know, against, you know, low quality, mid quality infantry units. They are a good harassing unit, and then they get even more range, more ammunition, as if they need it, better weapon, better missile strength. So yeah, overall, these guys will fit into any composition that you want to use for a harass strategy. Definitely good to reinforce an army, etc. You try them out, especially the Chariots of the High Elves. They're so undervalued compared to... That's mainly because they're in the wrong roster, let's say, because you have so many options. But the Chariots are really good for their, you know, for their worth and for what they can do in battle. Now to the first single entity, the Great Eagle. Very typical eagle, really. It does have not a lot of armor, but it does have decent melee attack, not a lot of melee defense, so it's more of like a charge idea unit. It does cause fear, which is always excellent, so you can use it as a, you know, a deterrent, you know, as causing the enemy leadership to fall down a little bit. Weapon strength, it's not a lot, but it does have not a lot. It's great, but it doesn't have a lot of armor piercing. That's what I was going to say. So in the late game, you could still field a couple of these guys, especially because they do get improved stats, including that that weapon strength and that charge bonus. So overall, still the same idea, you know, like a shock monster, really, single entity that you can use for a variety of roles, especially to harass the enemy missiles or backline. That's their main purpose. Also to gain control of the skies, even though you have better options, as you will see. Now, if you want a sort of cavalry unit, monster unit, you have the War Beasts, the War Lions of Shreyas. Not a lot of armor, but don't be surprised that they actually survive against enemy missiles because of that missile resistance. Good melee attack, not a lot of melee defense. They're like a glass cannon sort of idea. They do have an anti-infantry bonus and armor piercing. So these guys are great as a shock cavalry. You know, these are your armor piercing shock cavalry units to be real. Especially into the late game, they can become even much better with that speed, with that charge bonus increasing, and that weapon strength. So overall, a nice unit to have in nearly any composition, really. They are just quite vulnerable to enemy anti-large, so be careful with that, because these are not dogs. They are considered a large entity, so be wary of that. But still, awesome unit to have, especially well into the mid game, close to the late game, specifically against certain enemies that you will be able to set these guys against. Now to a Regiment of Renown, the Rahagras Pride, War Lines of Trace. Let me show you them here. Now it's better. They're still the same, but they do have some advantages. They have Strither, which means that the speed and combat penalties caused by terrain are ignored, which is excellent. That includes elevation. People didn't know that actually until quite recently. They have improved stats overall, so there'll be better versions of those. And they have an ability, which is a hex area ability that reduces the leadership and speed of all enemies in the area. So adding that leadership reduction with the fear, these guys are great, kind of like a terror bomb. You know, they don't have terror, but they can reduce the leadership significantly, and if you combine with anything with terror, then for sure they'll become quite useful. Definitely useful if you remember that ability, definitely useful in any army composition. Now to the Flamespire Phoenix. This monster doesn't have a lot of armor, it has tremendous speed and good melee attack values, still magical attacks and flaming attacks as well. Not a lot of melee defense, so be careful of prolonged combat with this little fella. Weapon strength is armor piercing, so it's quite useful in that regard as well. But then we have all the abilities. First, she has a bombardment ability. Typically because it has 10 charges, and notice that the cooldown is really not that much, so you can actually use this ability, bombard, and just keep moving and keep bombarding the whole front line. That's mainly how she's used, and then you can, you know, fall into the overall attack really, and can attack. She also causes terror, which is always nice, has a lot of fire resistance, 40%, decent ward save, 10%, which is always nice. I believe this is being given by someone, I'll have to check. Oh, actually, she has the passive ability, the Attuned to Magic, I forgot. So when the Winds of Magic power is 15, they do get magical attacks and the damage resistance. Forgot about that. And also the Rebirth. Now this is, I'm not going to go through this with every single Phoenix unit. All Phoenix units have the Rebirth ability, which is a chance of gaining hit points or instantly dying when they reach 10%, which is always nice. You know, they can, you know, it's kind of a nifty do or don't ability. So in the late game you can definitely use these guys because they get such improved stats. They can withstand the punishment in melee, of course, as you can see, 57, 58 stats, that's really good, and improved resistances there with more ward save and physical resistance, that's always nice. So yeah, by all means you can bring these guys, even if just for a little bit of flavor, well into the late game. Now, one of my favorite units in the roster, the Frostheart Phoenix. Why is it one of my favorites? So basically the same idea with the Flamespire, but better melee defense instead of melee attack. Still has magical attacks because it has the same Attuned to Magic, okay? So that ward save also comes from there. And then has the Frostbite, so reduces the enemy speed. Weapon strength is good with mainly armor piercing, but the main idea from this little girl is this: a hex ability all around her, all the time, a passive ability that reduces speed, charge speed, base weapon damage, melee attack and armor piercing weapon damage. So these guys are like a support unit. You can bring, you know, infantry, you can bring cavalry, and you can just put this little guy above and it will do the effect. So all the enemy will fight really poorly compared to others, and it's very difficult to see sometimes this. So it's really a nice addition, you know, combined with, you know, the fact that it causes terror, you know, and some other ideas. The enemy will be fighting for prolonged periods of time, losing leadership, and then with the terror they'll flee and you won the battle. It's quite a nice idea, and I always love to use some variety in the late game, like stated, and you can see there already the stats just improve overall, so you can definitely bring a couple of these for that tactic or others well into the late game. So now we get to the dragons. Overall they just get better overall, you know, in terms from the sun to the star to the moon dragons, you know, so to the moon to the star dragons, you'll see. So the stats get improved overall, but you can still use these lower quality, let's say, you know, this is not lower quality, but still dragons overall. So stats, not a lot of armor, but still 25% missile resistance, which is always nice. Good weapon strength, which is mainly armor piercing. Good charge value, so you can use it like a shock cavalry unit, really, basically get in, get out. decent melee attack and melee defense values, which is always great. Now the ability, the Sun Dragon's Breath, actually doesn't have a lot of armor piercing, but it is strong versus a single unit. So it causes fire damage, so that's always effective as well. Yeah, a decent monster unit, especially into the late game. As you can see, improved stats all over the board, just giving you more time to micro them and to ensure that they survive into the next battle. Then we have the Moon Dragon, basically the same, just an improved version of the Red Dragon. You can see there improved stats overall, more melee attack, more melee defense, better weapon strength, really, still decent armor piercing, really. A good idea here is that it is immune to psychology, so it's really cool as well. Still causing terror, still that 25% missile resistance, yeah, that's it. But it has an advantage here, because the breath, you know, now it does good against large combatants. It's a decent, do note that all of this, it's not shown in stats. Really check the description here, because it is useful to use, of course. So this breath is useful against large combatants, so very good to use against enemy flying units, for instance, or enemy lords and mounts, you know. So just ensure that you use each breath, each dragon's breath, against its intended target for the most, you know, for the best outcome possible. Now in terms of the stats later on, of course, much more improved stats in terms of armor, in terms of weapon strength, charge bonus. You can still use it like a shock unit, but still look at those melee stats, much better ones. So yeah, definitely a good addition to an army, especially a late game army, when you can get these guys and always benefit from that breath attack from them. Now to the Arcane Phoenix. So basically, just like the other phoenixes, really reduced armor, not a lot of melee defense, so be careful when engaging in battle, of course, but still quite a lot of weapon strength and armor piercing by nature. Still has that attuned to magic, so when winds of magic are 15 or greater, she does have that magical attack and ward save, which is excellent. She has physical resistance 20% and fire resistance 40%, causes terror, and then has this wonderful ability here with the Fiery Rebirth, which gives a heal and damages the enemies. So if she heals in combat, either she dies or she heals and actually does some damage to the enemies nearby. In addition to that, there's also an active ability of Vortex, which means that you can use, if you're flying over, basically you fly over and you can use this Vortex ability. It does decent damage, which is always nice. So overall, the other phoenixes, you know, the other phoenix has a bombardment spell, this one has a Vortex spell with 3 charges. Always useful to have in an army, especially if you can micro that. That's the biggest issue with these monsters. All of them kind of need a little bit of micro, so that's the problem. Now to Regiment of Renown, the Omen of Asuryan. Basically the same as the Arcane Phoenix, just better stats all around. As you can see on the previous one, I didn't mention the stats late game, but of course she gets much more improved stats, especially in terms of melee defense and melee attack, which you can also see here because of those improvements as well. The advantage here is that she gives immune to psychology. Oh, that's why the Moon Dragon had immune to psychology. I thought wrongly. I forgot about this ROR. That's the problem with having these RORs nearby. So yeah, she gives immune to psychology to everyone in range of 55 meters. A useful ability to have, of course. And in addition, still the fire resistance, still the physical resistance, that ward save because of the attuned to magic, and still the same vortex ability here. So yeah, quite a nice addition to your troops, especially for giving that immune to psychology, and she causes terror. So, you know, of course, the enemy won't be immune to psychology and will rout away. That's the idea, of course. And for the ultimate big boy, the Star Dragon. So basically, improved stats all over the board, melee attack 64, melee defense 50, so none of the weaknesses from the previous dragons. Even more weapon strength, still the decent speed and charge bonus, so that's really great. In the breath attack, it's good against armor and good against large combatants, so it's perfect to fight other single entities, lords and mounts, etc. Always nice to have a couple of these guys, or maybe even 3 of them, if you can bear the micro, of course. In the late game, they become just such a beast of a unit, really, with 82 melee attack, 71 melee defense base, 708 weapon strength. So yeah, useful against in any circumstance, in all circumstance. Just bring like 3 of these guys and you'll be done for it. And now to the only artillery unit from the High Elves, the Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers. Basically, the main idea from this artillery doesn't have too much range, 380 it's average, let's say. Of course, neglecting the stats because they're negligible. But the missile strength does have a bonuses versus large, or you can switch to bonuses versus infantry, and there's still armor piercing. So that's the versatility of this artillery unit, especially into in the early game, mid game. That's where they're most useful. Of course, in the later game, you have better options overall for the army, but still, you can field some armies with some bolt throwers just to take out enemy artillery, for instance, if you need, or just pepper down the enemy infantry or ranged units really with those anti-infantry missiles. There's still a decent flexible addition to the army. And there you go. That's all the units of the High Elf roster before, after, research, XP and Redline skills. I hope this helps you out to enjoy more balanced out compositions, different compositions. Maybe I give you an idea or two. That's precisely the goal of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you guys for the next one. Bye bye.